Good morning. Today, I'd like to talk about optimizing IVF lab workflows by looking at the data-driven insights, the association between lab management, procedural timings, and workload with blastulation rates. This video is based on a paper produced by several well-known Italian authors, published in Human Reproduction in 2025. So, as a spoiler alert, I always like to start off where I'm plan to finish. This file was not open access, which is a shame because there are so many great graphs that are not available for copyright reasons. However, the wider implications of the finding, which of course are in the abstract, these findings suggest that even large workloads can be managed without compromising IVF performance, provided that lab schedules and personnel are carefully coordinated to meet ideal timing requirements. And they suggested in the future artificial intelligence models may support these lab management activities by predicting workloads and helping to maintain timely schedules. While we can live in dreams. Okay, so this is a great paper with so much information about IVF laboratory demographics. There's lots of pearls of information, and I recommended all viewers read the paper if you have access to the article. The authors chose to use a KPI of blastulation rate per mature egg, which they abbreviate as MBR, as a tool to monitor performance of key procedures for embryo outcomes in the laboratory against the background of the changing caseloads over almost 8,000 cycles and 7 years. They used the KPI to monitor performance on each day of the week, but also to look at other things, including staffing, male factor infertility, incubator management, and media management. So they produced a series of graphs with sets of data on it, which I can't publish because of copyright reasons, but I've deconstructed and reconstructed what I believe is their estimated workloads. They broke down the various activities into procedures, which include oocyte retrievals, a fresh embryo transfer, vitrified warm DTs, oocyte warming, oocyte vitrification, surgical sperm retrievals, trifectoderm biopsies, embryo vitrification, leading to roundabout just under 200 procedures a week, or on average just under 27.7 procedures per day. So there could be more activities, but that's one the authors have chosen to look at. And of course, what stands out straight away is how few fresh transfers are done. Only 5 out of 30 cases. And how many warm for FETs that are performed. What stands out is the number of trifectoderm biopsies, 66 biopsies per week against a backdrop of 28 pickups a week. And almost of all those biopsies, well, they've obviously had a bit more vitrification, which I don't quite understand. So what's interesting for me is more than 80% of cycles did not go to fresh transfer. This means that over 80% of cycles either had a blastocyst biopsy or they were not suitable there were no suitable embryos, and therefore the embryo procedures were cancelled. And this is the thing which I think in all publications is a side issue. I get cross when I read publications talking about the number of pickups, the number of biopsies performed, but rarely do they talk about the data of the unsuccessful clients, the ones that do not have any embryos to biopsy, or the ones that do not have any euploid embryos. So these are the people that have paid a lot of money, had huge expectation, and have gone away without any transfer of embryos. It's a huge part of the IVF industry, which to me is fairly ignored, and there needs to be more publications on this. If you look at the number of biopsies, one assumes that the biopsies perform more than once in a cycle, presumably on day 5, or maybe day 6, or maybe even day 7. And I have no idea whether there's a fee, one single fee for a biopsy, or whether each biopsy is charged, and whether there's a separate fee for each freezing. But bottom line is, it makes the element of cycle management very unpredictable. The other interesting set of data is the number of oocyte vitrifications, which presumably is this one here, 1.7 procedures a week, roughly 2 a week. So one assumes this is for fertility preservation or oocyte donation and will be part of the oocyte retrieval data. There was roughly one oocyte warming and ICSI per week, which may be part of the PGA program. Another aspect would be that unlike freezing a few blastocysts, all the mature eggs are vitrified, doubling the workload and storage. And a lot of the, you can see here the oocyte warming, roughly 4 per week. So there's actually 4 thawing per week of oocytes, which will then lead to fertilization and to the biopsy as well. So it's actually a very complicated procedure, which isn't at all straightforward. And this is one reason why the paper, I think, should be commended for looking at it. The procedures need to be roughly equivalent in about the amount of time for setup, action, and cleanup. One of the problems with this type of allocation is that it's not so much a time of motion, but it's just basically it's an activity. But if you really wanted to, for staff allocation, you need to set up things which are roughly equivalent. And I noticed, as I said here, the data doesn't seem to amount for the time set up for setting up systems and for cleaning up. And there's no time set aside for administration, such as creation of files, data entry, etc. And this is a huge amount of work. You could also have allocated a unit value to each procedure, say roughly equivalent to staff hours. For instance, egg pickups might be 4 values and transfers might be 2, etc. Returning to PGA, if one adopts a policy of pushing it to its limits to try and transfer the best euploid embryo, which is highly commendable and does result in fewer miscarriages and a slightly shorter time to pregnancy, then this has implications on workload. Biopsies will need to be done on day 5 or more likely on day 6 and maybe even on day 7. And I was just reading an article recently looking at the quality of the ICM and the rate of development. And that data suggested that the ICM was the key parameter, and it may be better to delay biopsies until day 6 or the transfers until day 6 to ensure you know which embryo has the best ICM. So the day of biopsy and freezing may well be in a state of flux. However, you can't always plan for it, so workloads are unpredictable, and it increases the cost of the clinic and maybe the client. It will also increase the stress on the staff and the audit system being able to keep track of one case, one pickup having biopsies on day 5, biopsies on day 6, biopsies on day 7, and then trying to work all that out and manage it in future thawings becomes quite difficult. I commend the clinic for doing that. I've also deconstructed and reconstructed another set of data looking at the number of procedures per day. So this is all based on the fact that they're doing a lot of procedures and that the cycle management needs to take into account. But if you look at it across their 800 cycles, roughly 25% only ever had one pickup on a day, and just under 50% only had 1 or 2 pickups a day. So half their workload only ever had 1 or 2 pickups a day, which is, of course, is pretty manageable. Almost one person can manage that. And 2/3 of all pickups are managed within 3 to 4 pickups a day. 4 pickups a day is a reasonable number, but if you have enough staff, it's quite manageable. However, if you look at 5, 6, 7, 8 going up to 15 a day, numbers become quite small. And in reality, you wouldn't be planning for anything more than maybe 10. So it's basically less than 1% or 2% of all your caseloads are going to have more than 10 to 12, 15 pickups on a day. Very rare. But basically 75% of days had 4 pickups or less. This, of course, will include oocyte preservation cycles, and this has relevance later in looking at the time between egg collection and denuding of oocytes. If it was me, I would possibly go and do the PGTA cases for younger women first up here, so they can be processed. There'll be more eggs for those, more likely to have PGD, so you get those ICSIs done first. And then I would do the mature cases, the IVF cases, then the older women right at the very end was only 2 or 3 or 4 eggs, and then the oocyte freezing right at the very end. But you may want to turn around the other way and get the oocyte freezing done first to ensure that the eggs are denuded and frozen at the optimal time, since these oocytes will be in storage for up to 10, 15 years. If you go back and look at the number of procedures per staff member per day, if you look at roughly the number of procedures on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday. The thing that stands out is that Monday to Thursday are fairly regular days. Fridays are a bit quieter day. Presumably there are fewer pickups, etc. on Friday, but Saturday and Sunday are very, very busy. And this is the average number of staff per day, procedures per staff per day, procedures per staff on the day of the week, 3.7. So there's obviously a lot of staff allocated to these Monday to Fridays, but the procedures per staff suddenly shoot up to 7 on a Sunday. So even though there may be pickups on Saturday and Sunday, they're fairly rare. So throughout the study period, weekends consistently had the lowest staffing levels, resulting in increased workload per operator. On Saturdays and Sundays, procedures per operator were 1.4 to 2.4 times higher than during the week. Conversely, on Friday, the number of procedures per operator was quite low, and I think this is mainly because there's if you're doing pickups on Monday, but then there'll be no biopsies on Friday, except the occasional day 7. And I've actually done this based on graphical data, so there will be, you don't need to take this data literally, and if I made the wrong calculations, the authors can happily make a comment or contact me directly, and I'll redo the talk. And the interesting thing for me when I looked at it was, in other studies looking at errors on electronic witnessing, it was the weekends when most errors occurred. Maybe it's better staffing on the weekends would lessen the risk of potential future litigation. So if all cases go to blastocysts, then Monday collections will mean a weekend biopsy and vitrification. There theoretically should be very few biopsies on Friday, and overall, there was no significant difference between workload and the day of the week, basically Monday to Friday. The authors reported that procedures per staff per day fell for a few years as new staff were introduced, but then as they became trained and new cases increased. So obviously what happened was they had a caseload started to rise. They put on new staff to train them, so then the caseloads per staff fell, but bit by bit the numbers continued to increase back to where they were before. The authors reported this statistic over the day of the week, but space and staff will always increase activity until there's a natural limits to reach. And this is the graph I was talking about, which I can't present for copyright reasons. The authors suggest that maybe in the future, AI could use the pre-collection information to predict future workloads for each day and organize rosters for maximum efficiency. Okay. The second part of the talk is looking at the API of blastocysts per mature oocyte. There's the mean blastulation rate per cohort of inseminated metaphase 2 oocytes. The overall blastulation rate was 35%, with 79% of cycles resulting in at least one biopsy, one blastocyst obtained. Now, whether that was biopsy or not is another matter. Normally, you would only biopsy if there's 2 or 3. So basically, only a third of all eggs ended up becoming a blastocyst, and that occurred in only 80% of cycles. So 20% of cycles, you did the pickup, you did the ICSI, you did the denuding, the ICSI, but in fact, there was no blastocysts, so I assume they were all cancelled, or maybe done on day 3, but I think this clinic didn't do day 3 transfers. There was no significant association was found between daily workload and the MBR, indicating that the number of daily procedures did not impact on laboratory performance. But if 80% of cases had at least one transfer, then what happened to the remaining 21%? And I assumed that they were just cancelled. Well, the question is, how many blastocysts do you need to perform a PGTA? And if there's no data on how many cases had no euploid embryos. So there's a bit of data missing for me. But the most important thing of the whole paper was this graph. This is the graph, which I can't show because of copyright reasons, but this is my summary of it. This is the relationship between blastulation rate and client age, and the line of best fit is basically a straight line showing the rate decreases over time. But using a technique that they call LOES, which is the locally estimated scatterplot smoothing, which I'm not aware of, they produced a graph which is something similar to this, whereby the number of blastocysts blastocysts per mature egg, sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied here, was fairly similar. So roughly 1 in 3 of all eggs you collect up to the age of 35 will form a blastocyst. And this starts to fall away, so you get fewer and fewer blastocysts per egg when you get into the 40s. Excuse me. This suggests that the blastulation rate is similar for cases up to 35, and thereafter it declines. The interesting aspect of using the MBR is that as a KPI, it only works for women under 36. If used as an overall KPI, then you will depend on the mix of young and old cases in the cohort, and that should be another KPI. This is why the primary KPI of cases should be for 35 and under. So if you're using this as a KPI, you would report the number of blastocysts per oocyte for women under 35, and you just ignore that part of your quality management system. This, I think, was the most important graph of the whole paper, and it's a shame it's under copyright. It also implies that there are only 40% of oocytes per yield of blastocysts, and this decreases over 35 years of age. It also means that 60% of all oocytes will fail, and that a huge effort is made in denuding, injecting, and culturing only to discard at the end. You can see here, for instance, on the side is that AI systems looking at egg quality, trying to predict blastocysts from egg quality, may have considerable value. I'm a great believer in follicle vascularization, and of which only a quarter to a third of all follicles are only vascularized in controlled hyperstimulation systems, roughly equivalent to the number of blastocysts per egg. And so it may well be that the future impact of AI will be not on managing cycles, but actually predicting the number of cases with a blastocyst to biopsy. Okay. All right, so getting back to this, it means 6% of all oocytes will not form blastocysts, but of the 40% or 50% that do, only half of those will be euploid. Therefore, only about 20% of all oocytes will produce a viable embryo. So if this was mean euploid embryos per oocyte, the graph would be down here somewhere, and maybe this is not sensitive enough for KPI. Depending on follicle recruitment, this data could be used to predict the number of PGDA cycles with case loads 5 to 6 days later. So it might be that when there's 10 follicles or more, you'll be guaranteed to get 2 to 3 enough mature oocytes to give you 2 to 3 blasts for biopsy. Okay. Some key points from this KPI. The blastulation rate was impacted by female age, it decreased. It was also impacted by male infertility, so the blastulation rate was lower for male infertile cases. Undisturbed incubators, such as the time-lapse, regardless of whether it was dry or humidified, showed better performance than standard incubators. And you had a similar blastulation rate with the version that was being used in media, in a single drop media, versus the newer version that capitulates a well-in-the-well design. So that's just the type of dish may have been really important, but like all these things, at the end of the day, it doesn't seem to make a difference. What I thought was interesting was that the two different media they used, which were continuous media, and they did actually change several media through that 7-year period, versus the period to the sequential media. This was sort of glossed over a little bit in the paper and stuff, but for me, all the work we've done for 20 years of IVF using sequential media, taking embryos out, moving them, putting them back into new media, making up new dishes, etc., have all been shown with time-lapse systems that are just a continuous media, which is what we started with back in the very early days, are superior. And it may well be that even though there may be some value in using sequential media of essential and non-essential amino acids, etc., and glucose level, at the end of the day, it's better just to leave the embryo quietly, unperturbed, just growing quietly rather than anything else. So the blastulation rate was impacted. This is the last little bit of the talk. And the key point here was that the blastulation rate per egg was impacted by the time from ovulation trigger to denuding. So using this KPI, you could demonstrate it was not impacted by year. It was the same year by year by year, or the day of the week, or the number of specific oocyte retrieval on the day of the week. There was no real difference between the hours between ovulation and oocyte retrieval. So if the retrievals are getting late, it didn't seem to impact it. Nor from the induction of ovulation to denuding of the oocytes. But in a fairly low level of significance, the time between the induction of oocyte retrieval and denuding was important. And if you go back and look at this, the time from oocyte collection to denuding, and the number of cases per day. So this is the one case, these are the number of cases, etc. And this is the average number of hours. This is the graph that I can't show, but I've deconstructed and reconstructed the data. And you can see here that as more and more cases went on, the time between collection and denuding increased by about half an hour. So say 4 hours to 4.5 hours, etc. And then when there's really, really busy cases, for some reason, they obviously put more staff on and that was a bit quicker. But if you look at the mean blastulation rate per mature oocyte, 37, 37, 35, 33, so it starts to fall away. And then there's a bit of spiky, and then data becomes a bit unpredictable. But essentially, you can see the blastulation rate was falling from about 37% down to 32, 33%, almost 30% when there are 8 or 9 cases. So the mean blastulation rate per egg varies significantly across the specific sequential oocyte retrievals of the working day from 1 to 15 in a day. In these cases, all timings were also significantly different across the sequential oocyte retrievals, being progressively longer from the 1st to the 10th retrieval. And as a result, the blastulation rate started to fall. In other words, if you delay oocyte denuding in ICSI even by half an hour to an hour, it may impact on roughly half of a blastocyst per egg. Okay. So actually, if you look at all the data from the tables, the time from egg collection to denuding was fairly similar until Sunday. Higher mean blastulation rates were on Monday and Tuesday. The time for recovery rate from denuding fell from 2.4 hours on Sunday to 3.9 hours on a Monday. So obviously they do some pickups on a Sunday. It's just possible clinics are waiting too long to perform denuding of ICSI, and the best eggs are always the ones that are mature at pickup. And time-lapse systems no longer need to delay ICSI to see the pronuclei on the day 1. So in fact, you can not be bound by the need to see the eggs on day 1 to when you do the ICSI, since you can do it all on time-lapse systems. So the comments. This article is about performance between working days and between years as a function of the number of cases and the number of staff. It's not about pregnancy rates. It is used a combination of procedures to measure workload and found activity and staff numbers to be in control. Using a case such as blastocysts per mature oocyte, identify workloads and did identify some variable in the time from oocyte denuding and ICSI. The time between oocyte retrieval and denuding, 2 to 6 hours, showed a significant association with a lower chance to obtain at least one blastocyst in extended cases. I couldn't find any data looking at the impact on euploidy rates and pregnancy rates, but I don't think that was the purpose of the paper. So in summary, within the limits of the clinic's activity and staffing levels, one may feel reassured that laboratory performances have not been impacted by increased workload. But while not discussed here, the real limitation is the equipment needed to complete tasks, such as the number of ICSI machines or biopsy machines. There may also be an issue of oocyte aging if the weight becomes excessive, but this will be rare. And you may well be able to manage it in a way by selecting the cases that most likely with PGD or having ICSI, but large numbers of eggs being done first. The clinics may need to be aware of their own procedure limitations, too many recoveries on one day, and start planning a staffing level spacing equipment if demand for IVF service starts to increase above a set limit. So just a word from my sponsor, which is a website I run called FertAid. It's an online EQA program that can, in IVF and andrology, and is suitable both as training or assessments for small or large clinics, and can be used for training, competency, or accreditation. My name's James Stanger. I'm a member of my 50 years experience, and I have to say that I'm not a medical person, and this information is not medical advice, but it may help you in knowing what questions to ask about your treatment with your doctor, and maybe to help in understanding the advice you receive. If you like what I'm presenting here, click subscribe and write a comment and press like. Thank you for your time. We'll call it quits. Thank you.